In the summer of 1847, when the potato blight had already stolen 2 harvests and left the Irish countryside scattered with ghost villages, Baron William Ashworth received a letter that would change everything. The letter came from his estate manager in County Cork, written in shaking handwriting that betrayed desperation even through formal language. "My lord," it began, "the tenants gather daily at your gates. They do not come with anger or demands. They come with something far more dangerous, hope." What the Baron didn't know was that 3 days earlier, a young woman named Bridget O'Sullivan had stood before those same gates, her infant son pressed against her chest, and asked the gatekeeper a single question. Word of that question had spread through the starving village like wildfire, reaching every cottage, every family, every soul who had lost everything to the famine. The question was simple. Only 7 words. But it would force a man of privilege to confront the weight of 1,000 lives, test the boundaries between duty and humanity, and ultimately decide whether compassion could survive in a world built on power. By sunset on the day the Baron arrived at his Irish estate, the entire town would know his answer. And, for generations afterward, they would tell their children about the moment when one question changed the fate of everyone who heard it. This is the story of that question, and the impossible choice it demanded. Baron William Ashworth had never seen poverty like this. Standing at the window of his carriage as it rolled through the Irish countryside, he watched skeletal figures move through fields that should have been green with potato plants but instead lay black and rotting. The smell hit him first, the sickly sweet stench of decay that seemed to cling to everything. His estate manager, Thomas Hartwell, sat across from him, clutching a leather portfolio filled with documents that detailed the catastrophe. "The situation has worsened since my last letter, my lord," Hartwell said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've lost 37 families in the past month alone. Some to disease, others to..." He couldn't finish the sentence. The Baron had inherited this Irish estate from his father 3 years ago, but had never visited. His comfortable life in London, with its grand parties and political connections, had seemed a world away from this distant property that existed mainly as numbers in his account books. The rents from Irish tenants helped fund his lifestyle, but he had never thought about the actual people who paid those rents. They were abstract concepts, names on papers, amounts in ledgers. Now, seeing the reality, he felt something twist in his stomach. Children with hollow eyes watched his expensive carriage pass, their mothers clutching them protectively. Men who should have been strong farmers looked like walking skeletons, their clothes hanging loose on frames that had once been solid with muscle. "How many tenants remain?" the Baron asked. "Nearly 800 souls, my lord. They gather at your gates every morning, hoping for something. They don't make demands. They simply wait." The Baron had come to Ireland with a specific purpose. His London creditors were pressuring him, his political career required funding, and his wife expected to maintain their social standing. He needed to make a decision about the estate: either invest heavily to help the tenants survive, which would bankrupt him, or sell the land to investors who would clear it completely and convert it to grazing land for cattle. The second option would be profitable but would mean evicting every remaining family. As they approached the estate gates, the Baron saw them. Hundreds of people lined the road, sitting on stones, leaning against the stone walls, holding babies and supporting elderly relatives. They didn't shout or wave. They simply watched with eyes that held a mixture of hope and resignation that made the Baron's chest tighten. Among them stood Bridget O'Sullivan, though the Baron didn't know her name yet. At 19, she had already buried her husband to typhus and was now caring for her 6-month-old son alone. Her own mother had died 2 weeks earlier, leaving Bridget with nothing but the clothes they wore and a desperate determination to keep her child alive. 3 days earlier, Bridget had approached the estate's head gatekeeper, an elderly man named Murphy who had worked for the Baron's family for 30 years. Murphy had always been kind to the tenants, slipping them small amounts of food when he could, allowing them to shelter near the gates during the worst storms. "Murphy," Bridget had said, stepping forward from the crowd of waiting people. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Murphy had looked at her young face, seeing his own daughter who had died the previous winter. "Ask away, child." Bridget had shifted her son to her other arm, the baby so light now that she barely felt his weight. "If you were in my place, with nothing left but this baby, would you put your faith in the Baron's mercy? The question hung in the air between them. Murphy had served the family loyally for decades, had seen the old Baron's occasional acts of kindness and his moments of cold calculation. He knew that loyalty demanded he speak favorably of his employer. But he also knew that his answer might determine whether this young woman stayed to wait for help or used her last strength to walk to the workhouse in the next county. That's not a fair question to ask an old man, Murphy had said finally. It's the only question that matters, Bridget replied. Will he see us as people or as problems? Murphy had looked at the crowd of skeletal faces behind her, at the babies whose cries had grown weak from hunger, at the elderly who sat in the dirt because they no longer had the strength to stand. Then, he had done something that surprised even himself. I don't know, child. But I think that question deserves to be heard by the Baron himself. Word of Bridget's question had spread through the gathered families like ripples in a pond. By evening, everyone knew about the young mother who had asked whether the Baron would see them as people or problems. The question seemed to capture everything they felt but couldn't express, the fundamental uncertainty about whether their lives had any value to the man who controlled their fate. Some families packed their few belongings and left for the workhouse, deciding they couldn't afford to wait for an answer that might never come. Others stayed, drawn by the possibility that someone had finally asked the right question, that maybe this time would be different. As the Baron's carriage passed through the gates, he noticed a young woman standing slightly apart from the others. She held a baby against her chest and watched his carriage with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. There was something in her posture, not pleading or desperate, but expectant. As if she was waiting for him to prove something. Who is that young woman? He asked Hartwell. Bridget O'Sullivan, my lord. She's been here every day since her mother died. Lost her husband to the fever months ago. She's the one who. Hartwell hesitated. She's the one who what? She asked Murphy a question, my lord. About whether you would see the tenants as people or as problems. The whole village has been talking about it. The Baron felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Irish weather. In London, such directness would have been impertinent, easily dismissed. But, here, surrounded by the reality of suffering, the question felt like a weight settling on his shoulders. As the carriage pulled up to the manor house, a grand building that looked almost obscenely comfortable compared to the devastation outside its walls, the Baron saw servants hurrying to open doors and carry luggage. The contrast was jarring. Inside these walls would be warm fires, full meals, comfortable beds. Outside, people were dying of starvation and cold. That night, as the Baron sat in his father's old study, looking over the financial documents that detailed his options, he couldn't stop thinking about Bridget's question. The numbers were clear enough: he could sell to the land investors for enough money to solve his financial problems and return to his comfortable London life. The investors had already made it clear they wanted the land cleared of tenants within 6 months. But every time he picked up his pen to write the letter authorizing the sale, he saw those eyes watching his carriage. Not angry eyes or desperate eyes, but eyes that expected him to reveal what kind of man he truly was. The Baron had never thought of himself as particularly cruel or particularly kind. He was simply a man of his class, raised to see the world in terms of property and profit, duty and social standing. The tenants had always been part of the landscape, like trees or streams, part of what made the estate valuable, but not individuals with stories and hopes and fears. Now, sitting in the warmth of his study while hundreds of people waited outside in the cold, he felt something shifting inside him. The question Bridget had asked wasn't really about him at all, it was about her. About whether she should spend her last strength waiting for compassion from someone who had never needed compassion himself. As the clock struck midnight, the Baron made a decision that surprised him. Instead of writing to the investors, he took a sheet of paper and began writing a different letter entirely. He would send word to London that he needed more time to evaluate the property. He wouldn't make any irreversible decisions until he had done something his father had never done: actually talked to the people whose lives hung in the balance. Outside his window, he could see small fires burning where families had gathered to keep warm through the night. They had nowhere else to go, so they waited. And, for the first time in his life, Baron William Ashworth fell asleep wondering whether he was worthy of their hope. The next morning, Baron William Ashworth did something that shocked everyone, including himself. Instead of remaining safely inside the manor house while Hartwell handled the tenants, he walked directly to the estate gates where the crowd had been waiting since dawn. Bridget O'Sullivan was there again, her baby wrapped in a thin shawl that had once been her mother's wedding dress. She stood near the front of the group, not pushing forward but not hiding either. When she saw the Baron approaching, she straightened her shoulders and looked directly at him with those same expectant eyes. "Murphy," the Baron called to his gatekeeper.
"I understand one of the tenants asked you a question about me." Murphy's weathered face went pale.
In 30 years of service, he had never seen a landlord voluntarily approach a crowd of desperate tenants.
"Yes, my lord.
Miss O'Sullivan had some concerns about your intentions regarding the estate."
"I'd like to hear the question myself."
A murmur went through the crowd. Children pressed closer to their mothers, men removed their caps, and everyone seemed to hold their breath.
This wasn't how these encounters typically went.
Usually, estate managers delivered pronouncements from a distance, landlords remained invisible, and tenants were expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of mercy fell their way.
Bridget stepped forward slightly.
"I asked Murphy if you would see us as people or as problems, my lord." Her voice was clear but soft, without the anger or desperation the Baron had expected.
She spoke like someone asking for directions, practical and direct. "And what did Murphy tell you?"
"He said the question deserved to be heard by you directly." The Baron looked around at the faces surrounding him. These weren't the faceless masses he had imagined from his London drawing room. He saw a blacksmith whose hands were still strong despite his gaunt frame, an elderly woman holding twins who couldn't have been more than 2 years old, a teacher who clutched a small stack of books like they were made of gold. Each face told a story, and each story was about to end in one of two ways: salvation or destruction. "Walk with me," the Baron said to Bridget, surprising everyone including himself. They moved a few steps away from the crowd, far enough to speak privately but close enough that everyone could see them. The baby in Bridget's arms made a small sound, and the Baron found himself looking down at the child's face, thin but alert, with eyes that seemed impossibly old for someone so young.
"Tell me about your situation," the Baron said.
Bridget had prepared herself for many conversations, but not this one. She had expected either immediate dismissal or formal proclamations about the estate's future. She hadn't expected a direct question about her life.
"My husband died of typhus in January," she began.
"My mother died 2 weeks ago from fever. We lost our cottage when we couldn't pay rent, but we stayed nearby hoping things might change. I have no family left except him." She adjusted the baby slightly.
"His name is Sean."
"What did your husband do?" "He was a stone mason. Good with his hands, never afraid of hard work. Before the blight, we had enough."
"Not much, but enough."
Her voice caught slightly. "He built things that lasted. Our cottage had the strongest walls in the village because Patty knew how to set stones properly." The Baron found himself thinking about permanence, about things built to last. His own life had been built on things that seemed permanent: inherited wealth, established social position, the assumption that the world would always arrange itself for his convenience. But, standing here, looking at this young woman who had lost everything permanent in her life, he realized how fragile his assumptions really were.
"What do you need to survive?"
Bridget looked at him carefully, trying to read his intentions.
Was this genuine curiosity, or was he gathering information to use against them somehow?
"Honest work and fair wages," she said finally.
"A place to live that doesn't cost more than we can earn. Medicine when people get sick.
Food for the children before the parents eat."
She paused. "We don't want charity, my lord.
We want the chance to build our lives back up."
That afternoon, the Baron did something else unprecedented.
He spent several hours walking through what remained of the village, talking to families, seeing the inside of cottages where people were living 10 to a room because their own homes had been abandoned. He met the village doctor, who was treating patients with herbs and prayer because he had no medicine. He spoke with the priest, who was conducting funerals every day but hadn't performed a wedding or baptism in months because people were too focused on survival for celebrations. What struck him most was the dignity. Despite their desperate circumstances, people maintained their self-respect, kept their children clean, shared what little they had with neighbors who had even less. This wasn't the moral collapse he had been told accompanied poverty. This was a community trying to hold itself together in the face of catastrophe. That evening, the Baron sat in his study with a bottle of wine that probably cost more than most families had seen in months. On his desk were 3 letters, one from his wife in London complaining about delayed funds for her social events, one from his creditors demanding payment schedules, and one from the land investors offering terms for immediate purchase that would solve all his financial problems. He also had Hartwell's detailed report on what it would actually cost to help the tenants survive. The numbers were staggering. Providing work, food assistance, and basic housing improvements would require an investment that would leave the Baron financially ruined by London standards. He would have to sell his London house, dismiss most of his servants, give up his political ambitions, and live simply for years to come. But there was another set of numbers in Hartwell's report: the cost of displacement. 800 people forcibly removed from their homes. Families separated when they couldn't all fit in workhouses. Children orphaned when parents died from diseases that spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions. A community that had existed for generations simply erased. The Baron walked to his window and looked out at the small fires still burning where families were spending another cold night in the open. Tomorrow, he would have to give them an answer. Not just to Bridget's question, but to the larger question of what he valued most, his own comfort or their lives. As he watched, he saw a figure moving among the fires. It was Bridget, checking on other families, sharing something from a small pot she carried. She stopped at each fire, saying something that made people nod or sometimes smile. When she reached the fire where the elderly woman sat with the twins, Bridget knelt down and offered some of her own food to the children. The Baron realized he was witnessing something he had never seen before: leadership without authority. Bridget had no official position, no inherited power, no wealth to distribute. But people looked to her because she had asked the right question and because she acted on her convictions even when she had nothing left to lose. He thought about his own leadership: inherited titles, appointed positions, influence that came from family connections rather than personal choices. What would he be if all of that was stripped away? What would people think of him if they judged him only by his actions rather than his privileges? The next morning brought news that changed everything. A messenger arrived with a letter from London informing the Baron that political changes in Parliament meant his creditors were demanding immediate payment. He had exactly 30 days to settle his debts or face public bankruptcy and social ruin. The timing seemed almost designed to test him. He could sell the estate immediately, pay his debts, and return to London with his reputation intact. Or he could commit himself to helping the tenants, knowing that doing so would destroy everything his family had built over generations. Hartwell found him an hour later, standing in the estate's main hall staring at a portrait of his father, a stern man who had never questioned the natural order of privilege and obligation. "The tenants are gathering again, my lord," Hartwell said quietly. "They seem to sense that today will bring a decision." "How many remain?" "Nearly all of them, my lord. A few families left for the workhouse yesterday, but most have stayed. They're waiting for your answer to Miss O'Sullivan's question." The Baron looked at the portrait again, wondering what his father would have done. Probably the financially sensible thing: sell quickly, pay debts, maintain social standing. But his father had never stood face to face with Bridget O'Sullivan and seen what dignity looked like when everything else was stripped away. "Tell them I'll speak with them this afternoon," the Baron said. "All of them together." As word spread through the crowd that the Baron would address them personally, something electric ran through the gathered families. This was unprecedented. Landlords didn't explain themselves to tenants. They issued orders through managers and expected compliance without discussion. But this felt different. This felt like the moment when Bridget's question would finally get an answer, and that answer would determine not just their immediate fate, but what kind of story their children would tell about the day when everything changed. The Baron spent the morning writing letters to his wife, to his creditors, to the investors, and to his London solicitor. Each letter committed him to a different future, and he could send only one of them. By noon, he had made his choice. But, as he looked out at the crowd gathering in unprecedented numbers, people had walked from neighboring villages when they heard about the afternoon meeting, he wondered if he had the courage to follow through on what his conscience was demanding. By 3 o'clock, more than 1,000 people had gathered outside the estate gates. Word had spread to neighboring villages that Baron Ashworth would personally address his tenants about their future, something so unusual that people walked miles just to witness it. Children sat on their fathers' shoulders, elderly people leaned on walking sticks, and mothers held babies close, all waiting for an answer that would determine whether they lived or died. Bridget O'Sullivan stood in the same spot where she had been waiting for days, baby Sean quiet in her arms as if he too sensed the importance of the moment. She had not slept the previous night, thinking about all the possible answers to her question and trying to prepare herself for disappointment. Hope was dangerous when you had nothing left to lose. Baron William Ashworth walked through the gates alone, carrying no papers, flanked by no guards. He had left his formal coat inside and wore only a simple white shirt and dark trousers, as if he wanted nothing between himself and the crowd that might suggest his authority came from anything other than his words. The crowd fell silent as he approached. Even babies seemed to sense the gravity of the moment and stopped their crying. The Baron looked around at the faces surrounding him, hundreds of people whose lives hung in the balance of whatever he was about to say. "Miss O'Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "3 days ago, you asked a question about whether I would see you as people or as problems. I want to answer that question directly, in front of everyone here." Bridget felt her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment everything had been building toward. "But, first," the Baron continued, "I need to tell you what answering that question honestly is going to cost me." He pulled a letter from his pocket, one of the letters he had written that morning. "This is a letter to land investors in London, declining their offer to purchase this estate. That offer would have paid enough money to solve all of my financial problems and allow me to return to a comfortable life in London." He held up the letter so everyone could see it. "I am not sending this letter because I choose to invest in you instead." A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't what anyone had expected to hear. "This is what I am doing instead," the Baron said, pulling out a second letter. "I am selling my London house, my carriages, my artwork, and everything else I own of value. I am using that money to buy grain, medicine, and building materials. I am hiring every able-bodied man and woman here who wants to work, at fair wages, to rebuild this village and make this estate productive again." The murmur grew louder, people turning to look at each other with expressions of disbelief. "But, I need you to understand what this means," the Baron continued. "It means I will be living here, permanently, in Ireland. Not as a landlord visiting his property, but as someone whose success or failure is completely tied to yours. If this estate prospers, we all prosper. If it fails, we all fail together." An elderly man near the front of the crowd called out, "Why would you do this, my lord? You could live like a king in London." The Baron looked directly at Bridget as he answered. "Because Miss O'Sullivan asked the right question. She asked whether I would see you as people or as problems. I realized that for my entire life, I had been seeing everyone except my immediate family as problems to be managed or resources to be used. I had never asked myself what kind of man that made me." He stepped forward, closer to the crowd. "I have been incredibly fortunate in my life, and I confused that good fortune with virtue. I thought that because I had been born to wealth and privilege, I must have somehow deserved it. I thought that because others had less, they must have somehow deserved less. Miss O'Sullivan's question made me realize that the only thing I have ever truly earned is the choice I make right now." Bridget felt tears running down her cheeks. She had asked her question expecting either rejection or false promises. She had never expected honesty that cut this deep. "So here is my answer," the Baron said, raising his voice so everyone could hear clearly. "You are not problems to be solved or resources to be managed. You are the reason this place matters at all. Without you, this estate is just empty land. With you, it can be a community where families have futures and children grow up knowing their home is secure." He paused, looking around at faces that showed a mixture of hope and disbelief. "But, I need to be completely honest with you about what this means. The work will be hard." The first year will be especially difficult as we rebuild. I am not a magical solution to all problems.
What I am offering is partnership.
I will invest everything I have in this place and these people, but I need everyone who stays to commit to making this work together.
A woman in the back called out, "What if we fail? What if the crops don't grow or the work isn't enough?"
Then, we will face that together too, the Baron replied. I won't abandon you if times get harder.
This is no longer my estate with you as my tenants.
This is our community, and we succeed or fail as a community. The crowd began talking among themselves, voices rising in excitement, disbelief, and hope. Children who had been silent for months started laughing. Men who had been bent with despair began standing straighter. Women started planning out loud about gardens and schools and all the things they could build if they really had a secure future. But Bridget remained quiet, looking at the Baron with an expression he couldn't read.
"Miss O'Sullivan," he said, walking directly to her. "You asked the question that changed everything. What do you think of my answer?"
Bridget looked down at her son, then back up at the Baron. "I think," she said slowly, "that you answered a different question than the one I asked." The crowd fell silent again, waiting. "I asked whether you would see us as people or problems," Bridget continued. "But what you've told us is that you've decided to see yourself as a person instead of just a title.
That's actually better."
She shifted Sean to her other arm. "Because if you had just said you would help us while still thinking of yourself as fundamentally different from us, it would have been charity.
And charity can be withdrawn when circumstances change.
But if you really see yourself as one of us, as someone whose life is tied to ours, then we can trust you." The Baron felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't even realized was tight.
"Does that mean you'll stay? Will you help me figure out how to make this work?"
Bridget smiled for the first time in months.
"I'll stay.
We'll all stay and help you learn how to be part of a community instead of above it."
Over the following months, everything changed.
The Baron, who had never done physical labor in his life, learned to work alongside the men rebuilding cottages. He made mistakes constantly, hit his thumb with hammers, and had to be taught by teenagers how to plant crops properly. But he kept showing up, day after day, proving that his commitment was real. Bridget became the unofficial coordinator between the Baron and the tenants, helping him understand how the community actually functioned and teaching him which families needed extra help and which were ready to take on leadership roles themselves. She was also one of the first to point out his mistakes without fear, which everyone agreed was exactly what he needed. The first harvest was modest but sufficient. The village school reopened. Marriages and baptisms began happening again as people felt secure enough to plan for the future. Children who had been silent and withdrawn started playing again. By winter, visitors from neighboring estates were arriving to see what had happened at the Ashworth estate. Word had spread that a landlord had actually chosen his tenants over his own profits, and many people found this so unusual they had to see it for themselves.
Some visitors were other landlords, hoping to learn whether compassion could be profitable.
Others were tenants from nearby estates, hoping to find work or wondering if such transformations were possible elsewhere. But the most important visitor was the elderly priest from the next village, who came to ask the Baron a question. "I've heard remarkable stories about what you've accomplished here," the priest said.
"But I'm curious about something. Do you miss your old life?"
The Baron, whose hands were now permanently stained with dirt and whose back ached from honest work, thought about the question seriously. "I miss some things," he said finally. "I miss the certainty of knowing exactly where I fit in the world. I miss the simplicity of never questioning whether I deserved what I had.
But I don't miss feeling empty inside.
And I definitely don't miss lying awake at night wondering what kind of person I really was." The priest nodded.
"And what kind of person do you think you are now?"
"I think I'm someone who is still learning," the Baron replied. "But I know I'm someone who belongs somewhere, rather than someone who just owns things." Years later, when Bridget's son Sean was old enough to understand stories, she would tell him about the day when everything changed. About how sometimes the right question at the right moment could transform not just one person's life, but an entire community's future.
What was so special about the question? Sean would ask.
It wasn't the question itself, Bridget would explain. It was that someone finally cared enough about the answer to let it change them completely. The Baron could have said the right words and still kept his heart closed. Instead, he let the question crack him open and rebuild him from the inside. The story of Bridget's question and the Baron's answer spread throughout Ireland and eventually reached London, where it was talked about in drawing rooms and Parliament alike. Some people praised the Baron's sacrifice, others called him a fool for giving up his advantages. But, in the village that had been saved, people measured the story differently. They measured it in children who grew up secure, in marriages that lasted, in the knowledge that someone had chosen their lives over his comfort and proven that such choices were possible. Bridget O'Sullivan had asked whether she would be seen as a person or a problem. The answer had changed not just her fate, but had created a community where such questions would never need to be asked again.